It was the year 1915, the month of May, the last of spring. The world was plagued by a great war, unlike all conflicts seen before. Powerful nations ripped apart, like a horrific work of art, a painting drawn by death itself. Millions of lives destroyed by shells. And yet, amidst all the turmoil that had the blood of leaders boil, a major industry was booming. And even though the times were gloomy, great ocean liners were still sailing, impressing people, never failing. Most of them served the needs of combat, and not the luxuries before that. But there was one remaining true to her first purpose through and through, called Lusitania, the pride of the world famous Cunard Line. She was a beauty to behold, a sight to see for young and old. Four funnels reached out to the skies, completing her amazing height. Inside, she was a floating palace, free space and luxury, well balanced. But her advantage was her speed. Her owners knew that when there's need, she'd reach the farthest of Earth's corners. All that she needed was clear orders. On a routine Atlantic trip, which started on May 1st, passengers boarded her with joy, not thinking of the worst. And that despite a notice printed in the morning paper, a warning for them to beware, avoiding any danger. For after all, this was still war, and souls were lost each day. They wouldn't want a German submarine coming their way. But most passengers simply laughed, thinking this was a bluff, an overstatement, a plain joke. Of fear they'd felt enough. And so the giant liner sailed for the United Kingdom, almost without fear at all, and pleasant hopes to lean on. But everything wasn't so bright as people would have wanted. From Germany had also sailed the submarine U-20, commanded by a captain by the name of Walther Schwieger. His nature questioned to this day, as it was quite deceiving. He was a kind man to his crew and had a cheerful goodness, but to his enemies he was cold-blooded, cruel, and ruthless. He had a feverish desire to sink enemy vessels, and on that journey he had had a couple of successes. But as the days were passing by, 'twas not enough for Schwieger. He always searched the ocean on the hunt for something bigger. Meanwhile, the Lusitania kept sailing through her voyage. Of any threats or worries, passengers had no knowledge. They did not know, for instance, that the cargo holds beneath them contained a load of shells for guns the British Army needed. They also were not made aware that very little effort had been made to provide the ship with proper Navy escort. The Admiralty had the thought no other ships were needed. Seeing the liner fast enough to escape threats by speeding, her passengers were having fun by dancing, dining, talking, and others thinking pleasant thoughts while on the top deck walking. That journey mostly had calm seas and quite a stable weather, Everything seemed to be quite smooth and just as great as ever. But there was also something else very few people knew. In order to save money and keep their business through, the Cunard Line decided that, for now, it would be wise to sail her at 21 knots instead of 25. Thus, only three out of her four great boiler rooms were working. A giantess stripped of her strength. Now slower she was going. And then another problem arose, one caused solely by nature. Thick fog stood in the way of Lusitania's great venture. This caused her crew to take the risk and cut speed even more. The liner was now doing 3 knots slower than before. And if they knew, oh, if they knew the risk of that, if only, for under cover of the night was stalking the U-20. A game of cat and mouse, indeed, as Captain Walther Schwieger had passed the ship a couple times and had already seen her. On May the 7th, the last day of Lusitania's journey, she'd passed an uneventful night and quite a peaceful morning. There were a few more telegrams about submarines, but that threat seemed to be behind and nowhere to be seen. The shores of Northern Ireland had finally appeared. The end of this great voyage was at last so very near. The passengers were all content, enjoying their last meal. Just a bit over 2 o'clock, arrival on the heels. But suddenly, to great surprise, a shout tore the calm, like a disastrous hurricane coming to wreck it all. It all was quite apparent, and there was nothing to hide. Torpedoes spotted at the bow, right at the starboard side. Seconds ago, at this great ship, the whole world had admired. Commander Schwieger, on his boat, gave the command to fire. A burst, a trail of thin white foam, a quick, sharp turn to port. The liner's crew had turned to one last desperate resort. But the U-20 had released a powerful new weapon, one that, when reaching enemies, made sure nothing could help them. A new kind of torpedo that could move extremely fast, and quite soon hit the liner's hull, exploding with a blast. All of a sudden, oh good Lord, the fear, the pain, the terror! Everything shook with a great force, of which there was no telling. Passengers rolled across the deck, crew members just the same. Children called on their parents, through their tears screaming their names. The ship listed immediately, about 15 degrees. The panic building up had people praying on their knees, and even though it was quite clear that the great ship was doomed, the crew wanted the opposite by all to be assumed. The passengers were told the Lusitania is fine. She was the safest ship afloat, the finest of the line. But as the ship took water on and soon increased her list, even the crew found it hard on such light to insist. So Captain Turner went ahead to send an SOS. The fastest, grandest ship afloat reported great distress. Her dining rooms, her halls, her rooms were all rapidly flooded by act of war, so dark, so cruel, so ruthlessly cold-blooded. The situation became worse when a few minutes later, as the great ship bellowed in pain, her strength completely failing, a second blast tore through the Lusitania's steel soul, ignoring her loud screams of pain and tearing through it all. More shaking, a more violent force, more human lives are lost. But Captain William Turner was still standing at his post. The lifeboats became obsolete as soon as the ship listed. They swung and crashed on the ship's hull, but passengers persisted. They were still fighting for their lives and threw them in the water. Some of them drifted upside down at life's and death's thin borders. And soon, quite soon, the giantess began her final plunge, wailing and crying loudly, screaming in pain so much. Those who remained on board were still in agony and horror, and soon enough they met their end, a moment of great sorrow. But even those who were alive right after the disaster, they all just had a tiny chance. The ocean was their master. The cold of the Atlantic was so merciless and violent that even those whose hearts still beat were slowly falling silent. Whole hours had already passed when rescue ships arrived. There was a group of fishing boats at a horrific sight. People were fighting for their lives, battling the freezing waters. Fathers had sadly lost their sons. Mothers had lost their daughters. Even after the rescue, some eventually died. They couldn't bear the suffering that fell upon their lives. And yet, the sinking of the ship was only the beginning. A hurricane of questions through the public was now spinning. What led to such a tragedy, such awful loss of life? The horror of the incident nobody could deny. Before this day, it was believed that even in a war, there are some rules to follow through, some less clear, others more. But now, the boundaries were crossed. There was no going back. A ship full of civilians had been brutally attacked. A total of 1,198 were laying all together in an underwater grave. Among them were 100 children, some of them months old, who had just come into this world and left it hurt and cold. Legal inquiries began to find out all the answers. Officials, lawyers, judges looked all over the grim matters. At first, it even was believed that there were two torpedoes that ripped the Lusitania's hull due to how slow her speed was. But Schwieger said himself that this was far away from truth. He claimed he'd fired only one to carry his plan through. His submarine log claimed the same, and so he was believed, and the creation of a myth in that way was achieved about the munitions that the liner had been transporting, that they were why two times, not one, she ended up exploding. Over the years, however, this was proven to be false. This theory, it was revealed, had some very big flaws. The biggest flaw, of course, was that munitions that she did have were far from physically enough for such a blast to rip her. And even though some still insist her manifests were wrong, saying she carried much, much more than what the lists let on, experiments have shown that what most likely had occurred was not quite that mysterious, outlandish, or obscure. A much accepted theory says that when she was hit, the Lusitania's boilers, growling sadly in defeat, exploded, quickly sending her onto the ocean floor, as she then began sinking even faster than before. Many also had questions as to why there were no cruisers to guard the ship against attacks by lurking evildoers. However, though a lot of questions still remain unanswered, there's something very special about this disaster. You see, among those people who had perished on the ship, falling into what seemed to be a great eternal sleep, were 128 Americans, those souls whose loss caused the great outrage to reach the USA, where the bereaved society had many things to say. The country remained neutral up to now in the Great War, but after this cruel incident, tensions were growing more. While there were many other reasons for what happened next, the then President Woodrow Wilson did what he saw best. On April 2nd of the year of 1917, almost 2 years after the loss of Cunard's floating dream, a declaration of big change was presented and signed. No longer would the USA be watching from the side. That day was the beginning of a new difficult time. America would see her sons charging enemy lines, but still, the people's courage would ensure that they prevailed. Standing by the entire world, they couldn't afford to fail. With God's own holy providence, they would go through the war, emerging even stronger, more united than before. And even though, as said before, many factors had caused this, all the intense fighting and death, all the depressing losses, nobody ever shall forget the terrifying story of all the innocent lives lost on Lusitania's journey.